With the Soviet Union officially no more, it looked like Yugoslavia was going the same way, only more violently, as the Yugoslav National Army finally took the Croatian cities of Vukovar and Dubrovnik in November after long sieges, and the fall of Vukovar in particular was followed by massacres of civilians and Croatian militia alike, and the removal of survivors to transit or refugee camps under Serbian control. The Croatian forces counterattacked in December, and a series of foreign-brokered ceasefires, 14 in 6 months, were signed and just as quickly broken on both sides. The 15th ceasefire, brokered by the UN in January 1992, was intended to stick, with a peacekeeping force of nearly 25,000 personnel from a variety of nations under the command of an Indian general deployed to stop the bloodshed. Croatia and Slovenia were officially recognised by the European community. Iceland had been the first to recognise Croatia back in December, and the Federal Army withdrew into Bosnia-Herzegovina, another Yugoslav republic with a mix of ethnic and religious groups. One of those groups, the Bosnian Serbs, had already declared their own independent enclave called Republika Srpska within Bosnia, and many feared more violence to come. Violence had already come to another part of the former Soviet Union, though, as the simmering conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the fate of the Nagorno-Karabakh region erupted into full-scale war between the newly independent nations, as Armenia tried to forcibly create a land corridor linking the country proper with the exclave, an Armenian-populated region that had been ruled by the Azeri Republic in Soviet days, but with maps being redrawn all over the place, many saw an opportunity to unite with Armenia, while the Turkish government supported their co-religionists in Baku. In February, the 12 members of the European Community signed the Maastricht Treaty, which founded the European Union to replace it. The intent was for an ever-closer union of the nations with a shared citizenship, a common currency, provisionally referred to as the ECU, European Currency Unit, as well as vaguer aspirations for common foreign and defence policies and beefing up the role of the European Parliament. Despite the optimistic rhetoric, many within the newly created EU were sceptical about the prospect of a so-called United States of Europe and worried about losing their distinctive cultural and national sovereignty. The day after the signing of the treaty, the Winter Olympics opened in Albertville in the French Alps. With the imminent change to the Olympic cycle, this would be the last Winter Games to take place in the same year as the summer event, and it would be just 2 years until the next Winter Games at Lillehammer in Norway. 64 nations attended, including 7 first-timers. Algeria, a nation collapsing into civil war even as its 4 skiers marched in the opening ceremony. Bermuda, who sent a single luger. Brazil, 7 alpine skiers. Honduras, 1 cross-country skier. Ireland with a 4-man bob team. Swaziland with a single alpine skier. And Croatia and Slovenia. War-torn Croatia sent 3 skiers and a figure skater, but peaceful Alpine Slovenia sent a substantial team of 27 across 6 sports, while the Yugoslav team could only manage 25. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania also sent delegates for their first appearances since the 1936 Games in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, meanwhile, agreed to enter a common team as they'd all trained together under the Soviet flag, and their ice hockey team was hotly tipped. Officially dubbed the Unified Team and competing under the Olympic flag, they won the ice hockey, along with 8 other gold medals, 6 silver and 8 bronze, to come second in the overall medals table, just behind the newly unified Germany team. With the end of the 1991 season, there were negotiations between the teams and FISA's new boss Max Mosley. Everyone agreed that the introduction of the turbo ban a few years ago had worked well, and that going forward changes should be gradual. Mosley announced that he wanted to slow cars down a bit, especially in corners, but this would be done in stages between 1993 and 95. For 1992, the major rules change was that all teams would now be required to enter 2 cars to discourage experimental projects like Life or tiny teams like Coloni struggling to make ends meet. This wasn't entirely uncontroversial. The global recession had taken its toll over the years, and the influx of teams following the turbo ban had been winnowed down a bit. But just as in the old ground effect days, it was felt that the sport was becoming much more technical, and the gap between fastest and slowest was becoming wider, which could prove a literal hazard on track. In addition, unleaded fuel would now be required throughout, for health and environment reasons, while circuits would have to widen pit lanes, lower curbs, and add a chicane in the pit entrance to slow cars down on the approach. Another casualty of the recession was the tyre competition, with Pirelli withdrawing at the end of 1991 following an internal restructure after 3 years and just 1 win, and that was Piquet's inherited win in Canada. Goodyear would thus have a monopoly for 1992, which they weren't entirely happy with, but negotiated with FISA that they would no longer supply super sticky qualifying tyres to reduce costs, and that any new manufacturer coming in would have to supply at least a quarter of the grid to stop people coming in and cherry-picking the best teams. The 1992 calendar was broadly the same as in 1991, but with one big difference and a couple of races moving around. After 3 years of disappointing gates, the Phoenix race was shelved in favour of a return to a heavily revised Kyalami. For the first time ever, there would be no championship race in the US, but for the first time since 1985, there would at least be one race on every inhabited continent. That had only actually been true once. The South African Grand Prix had last been held in 1985, the same year Australia was added to the calendar, but the South African race was eventually cancelled after much controversy as part of sporting sanctions against South Africa. Now, with the final end of apartheid in sight, sport was coming back. The South African Grand Prix on a 5-year contract and the Rugby Union World Cup awarded for 1995. Elsewhere, the Mexican Grand Prix had moved to be the second race in March, while Spain had also moved up the order, now being the first European race in May to get it out of the way before the Barcelona Olympics. There had been an attempt to return the Austrian Grand Prix to the calendar and a proposal for a European Grand Prix at Jerez, but both of those plans fell through. McLaren Honda. 4 years in a row now, McLaren have won both Drivers' and Constructors' Championships, but once the champagne had been finished off, Ron Dennis and co had to admit that the 1991 titles had been a bit fortunate, and that Williams had been the faster car for much of the season. A new McLaren, the MP47, was in design, stuffed full of technology including power-assisted suspension, a semi-automatic gearbox and electronic fly-by-wire throttle to close the tech gap with Williams. Roberto Moreno had been shaking it down in Japan as Honda worked on a new lighter V12. It was a big gamble, given the teething troubles Frank's boys had had early on in 1991, but if it paid off, McLaren would be right back at the front. Like Germany in the football, you never write off McLaren. Car 1. Ayrton Senna. The youngest triple champion in history now has the same number of titles as his great rivals Prost and Piquet, and at 32 he is still capable of going better and being the first man since Fangio to win 4, or even 5. It was his supreme talent that made the difference in 1991, but much will depend on whether McLaren can deliver him the car he needs. He's let it be known that he'd love to drive a Williams, but whether that's realistic or just negotiating tactics remains to be seen. Car 2. Gerhard Berger. The Austrians had a pretty torrid time in the McLaren with just one gifted win in his 2 years. He is rarely seen without a smile though, and gets on famously with his teammate, but there must be a sense that this last year of his contract will be make or break for his career. Can he show the quality everyone knows he has from his Ferrari days, or will he continue to be overshadowed by his illustrious teammate? Tyrrell Ilmore. A disappointing 1991 and a catastrophic end of season saw Ken Tyrrell looking to sell up, but Bernie Ecclestone bailed him out with a big loan and brokered a deal with Marlboro, who brought in 2 of their pet drivers, Olivier Gouillard and Andrea de Cesaris, and Bernie also helped negotiate a supply of Ilmore V10 engines. These will be mounted in the rear of the same chassis as 1991, updated to B-spec by Mike Coughlin, under the management of George Wrighton. Expectations are much lower than 12 months earlier, but that in itself might be a boon. The only way is up, after all. Car 3. Olivier Gouillard. The young Frenchman, nicknamed Mimos, enters his 4th season of F1 with his 4th team, 5 if you count Azella and Fondmetal as 2, and having gained a reputation for being reckless and difficult to lap. Tyrrell will probably be a step up from Fondmetal and definitely from AGS where he ended up in 1991, but whether that'll be good enough for him to make his mark in a good way remains to be seen. Car 4. Andrea de Cesaris. De Cesaris was something of a revelation in 1991, long derided as, at best, a stolid midfielder and at worst as Andrea de Crasheris. He showed maturity and a competitive streak when given decent machinery. Few, after all, expected to see him racing Senna for the lead, never mind in a first-year team. His substantial backing from Marlboro Italia may well have brought him to Tyrrell, but fans of the venerable English team can be more optimistic with him in the car than they might have been a year earlier. Williams Renault. So near yet so far in 1991, but Frank Williams and Patrick Head, not to mention Renault's chief designer Bernard Dudot, remained confident that by the end of the year they'd got the best car on the grid. For 1992 they've elected to stick with the FW14, now the FW14B, with the new FW15 being planned for later in the season to make sure that test driver Damon Hill can work all the kinks out of it first. The FW14B is the team's most technically advanced F1 car yet, with the semi-automatic gearbox and active suspension systems, now supplemented with traction control, an electronic system that adjusts revs to prevent wheel spin when the driver plants the throttle. There are some who will demur at this level of electronic assistance, but the main concern of the team and drivers will be whether it all works. Car 5, Nigel Mansell. Depending on who you ask, Nigel Mansell is either a brave, gritty driver who has narrowly missed out on 3 titles due to bad luck, or a journeyman hack who doesn't have what it takes to win titles and just always has an excuse. This looks like his best chance in years to finally take that step, and at 39 he can't have many more chances left in him, especially as the noises that Renault want to parachute Prost into the team for 1993, which Nigel will surely not accept. Car 6, Riccardo Patrese. Patrese is actually just under a year younger than Mansell, but has another 4 years of F1 under his belt, which makes him the old man of the team. He had one of his best seasons yet in 1991, winning twice, demolishing Mansell in qualifying, and taking a well-deserved overall 3rd place in the standings. He's pretty much banished the has-been accusations and never looked like he was settling for being number 2 the way Berger did at McLaren, and given Williams insist there are no team orders, if the situation develops to his advantage he might even have a chance at the title. Brabham Judd. Down to just 14 employees, not including former manager Herbie Blash, who took an offer from Yamaha to go with them and become their F1 representative, the Brabham team staggered to the start line in 1992 thanks again to some Marlboro money, paying for a supply of ex-Dallara Judd V10s and smaller amounts brought in by its pay drivers, especially Eric van der Poel's lease plan sponsor. Unfortunately, the Japanese connection via Akihiko Nakaya fell through when he was refused a super license thanks to the FIA not recognising Japanese F3000 as a sufficiently competitive stepping stone. Instead, after talking to a few drivers and sponsors, new team boss Dennis Nursey announced that car number 8 would be occupied by the first woman driver in F1 since Desiree Wilson in 1980 and the first with a regular contract since Lella Lombardi in the mid-70s. Giovanna Amati's junior record isn't stellar, but she's well back financially, which is the main consideration, and the publicity probably won't do the team any harm either. Car 7, Eric van der Poel. Tintin, as Eric is inevitably known, had a pretty torrid first season in F1, but with the underfunded and undermined Modena Lamborghini team that was hardly surprising. He showed some class at Imola, only to be denied by a late breakdown, but was usually outqualified and generally outshone by the more experienced number 1 driver Larini. He'll be number 1 at Brabham, but whether that is worth anything much is another matter entirely. Car 8, Giovanna Amati. Giovanna Amati was the daughter of an actress and a cinema chain owner, and the family were pretty well off, which is why in 1978, at the age of 19, young Giovanna was kidnapped for ransom. Kept in a wooden cage for 75 days and abused both mentally and physically by her captor, she was eventually released after her family found the 800 million lira ransom, famously partly paid for by the box office receipts from showing Star Wars in Italy, as well as selling family jewels and even borrowing money from some of the domestic staff. By that time, Giovanna had already taken an interest in driving and attended racing school along with her good friend Elio De Angelis. While he had an easier passage into F1, she stalled a little due to sponsorship, spending 4 years in Formula Abarth before finally moving up to Italian F3 in 1985. She won a few times but never really dazzled before moving up to F3000 in 1987. She only qualified once that year but tried again in 1988, where her fortunes improved to garner her 2 10th places. She tried to kickstart her career in Japan in 1989 but without success, and returned to International F3000 for 1990 and 91. Despite indifferent results, a few top 10 finishes but not scoring a point, she was offered a Benetton test and completed 30 laps. But then in January 1992 the Brabham opportunity dropped in her lap. Given her lack of success in the lower divisions, there have naturally been some unkind rumours about exactly how she got her seat, especially as she's been championed by Italian PM Giulio Andreotti personally, and at 32 she's unlikely to have a long and illustrious career, but she'll be hoping to acquit herself well and maybe blaze a trail for more women in the sport. Footwork Mugen Honda. 1991 was one of the team's worst years ever since its formation as Arrows in the late 70s. The Porsche engine proved almost literally a millstone round the car's neck, Alex Caffey fell out with the team, and Michele Alboreto often looked demotivated. For 1992, the team have acquired the Honda V10 engines that Tyrrell so signally failed to make good use of last year. 1990 vintage units, they have been heavily tuned and branded with the Mugen label, a company formed by Soichiro Honda's son, who've been tuning Honda engines in F1 and badging them in F3000 for a couple of years now. Coming in as part of the deal is Aguri Suzuki, and if nothing else, the new version of the footwork livery looks really neat. Car 9, Michele Alboreto. The veteran must have wondered at times in 1991 what he was doing getting up early for pre-qualifying when he'd been driving a Ferrari just 4 years earlier. Footwork's performance was certainly a low point in his career, and he has still yet to score a point in his 2 years with the team. His experience, though, has been an asset to Jackie Oliver's team for sure, and he definitely outperformed Caffey in 1991, but he must have a bit of money put away, and you wonder, unless things improve soon, whether he'll stick around. Car 10, Aguri Suzuki. Suzuki's stock fell somewhat during 1991, especially with that spate of DNQs towards the end of the season, but he remains the first Japanese driver ever to stand on an F1 podium, and with the retirement of Satoru Nakajima, he's his country's new hero and their top driver. That's got to be good for his morale, as much as the team's profile and balance sheet, and his personal sponsorship from Toshiba is a good fillip for the coffers. He'll be hoping for better this year. Lotus Ford. 1991 had been a year of promise rather than results, with that spectacular race in Imola the only points for the team and a few DNQs to balance it out, but overall it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it could have been. After much toing and froing over engines, the team have ended up with a supply of Ford HB V8 engines, the same A5 Evolution that powered the 1991 Benetton, but a lack of resources means they will at least begin the season with the 102 chassis designed at the end of 1989. The team raced the 102B last year. The 102C was the test mule for the abandoned Isuzu V10 engine project, so the new car is the 102D. There are some positives though. The team have the talented driver pairing of Mika Hakkinen and Johnny Herbert, who's raced sponsorship for a full season, so there shouldn't be as much chopping and changing in car 12. Plus the new British Racing green and gold livery, recalling the classic Lotus colours of the pre-sponsorship 60s days, is really good. A new car is being worked on for later in the season. Car 11, Mika Hakkinen. The youngest man in the paddock in 1991, the Finn gave a good account of himself on the occasions when the car allowed him. But his experience and over-enthusiasm showed on occasion, and he was notably outqualified by Herbert in the latter races. He may not be the finished article quite yet, but if the team can provide a decent car, he could do well. Car 12, Johnny Herbert. Johnny's been the coming man for a few years now, but must be regretting the decision to start the 1989 season rather than giving it longer to recover from his foot injuries. Of course, that might have meant he never got his break at all, but still, he has yet to drive a full season in F1. He hopes to change that in 1992 and take advantage of the fact that he's been Lotus test driver since 1990, so he really knows that 102 chassis. Fondmetal Ford. Despite Gabriele Rumi's apparent exasperation, the Fondmetal, formerly Ozella squad, had a reasonably good season by their lights in 1991. The formation of the Fomet think tank in the UK produced a decent little chassis, even if it was still a bit underpowered, but unfortunately Rumi's money troubles have led to Fomet being cut loose, and the chassis intended for Fondmetal in 1992 has been sold instead to Gerard Larousse. Instead, the Fomet 1, now rebadged as the GR01, will continue into 1992 while a new chassis is developed. At least the team have retained the services of Gabriele Tarquini, a master at wringing a decent performance out of a duff car after his late move from AGS last year. He will be joined by the Italian-Swiss rookie Andrea Chiesa as the team expands to 2 cars in line with the new regulations. Car 14, Andrea Chiesa. Born in Milan, Chiesa first came to attention at the age of 18 in the Swiss Karting Championship. He won the title in his sophomore year, 1983, but opted to stay in karts a further year, placing 3rd in the European Series before moving up to cars with a course at the CSIA Racing School in Italy. For 1986 he joined Italian F3 full-time, racing with the Pino Trivatello team to 10th place overall despite an unreliable engine. 1987 saw him move to the Pavanello team and win 3 of the first 4 races, only for the wheels to come off his season later on and miss out on the title to Enrico Battaglia by just 4 points. 1988 saw a move up to F3000, where he struggled initially but again came good in his second year, leading the championship at one stage before coming 6th overall. However, he was starting to run out of funding, and after failing to secure an F1 drive in 1991, he endured a trying season with the backmarker Appomattox team. Nonetheless, he had come to the attention of Gabriele Rumi and was finally given his chance. Car 15, Gabriele Tarquini. After several years doggedly plugging away at the now-defunct AGS team, Tarquini proved an instant hit with the Italian Fonmetal team when he moved there following the sacking of the apparently petulant Guiar. Tarquini is definitely talented and probably deserves better machinery than this, but Fonmetal showed signs of promise last year, and if they can deliver even a half-decent car, then he may yet be given the chance to show his quality.